Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this month's Balance webinar. Today we're going to be talking about social media, and we've called this Turning Inertia into Community, as in turning something that's traditionally negative about financial services, the fact that people don't necessarily move around too much because they can't be bothered, into turning a positive, which is how do we turn that group of people into a community for us all. Okay, so a little bit about Balance. Balance is a financial services specialist marketing agency. I spent many years working on the other side with you guys and decided that there weren't any agencies out there that really catered to our needs, which were specifically challenges with regulation, which we'll come across later, challenges with resource and having big enough teams to actually do all of these things, and of course the ever-present challenge of ROI. We're lucky enough over the last 3 years to have worked with some brilliant clients, and that has got us some fantastic awards. Balance works with lots of channels. We work, of course, with social media, which we'll be covering today, but we work in both paid and organic search, content, obviously digital PR, and lots of others besides. We're very fortunate to have worked with some fantastic brands. I'm not going to list them all here, but hopefully it gives you a bit of confidence that we know a little bit about what we're talking about here. So before we launch into what we mean by community and the rest, I'm going to introduce my colleague Sophie. Sophie is our social media specialist here and leads on the channel for us, and she'll be saying a lot of clever stuff to me around social media because that's her area of expertise. So you'll see us alternate throughout the rest of the video. So anyone can manage social media, right? I think we've all been there where the CEO's granddaughter's on TikTok, so therefore probably thinks that social media is just a doddle. But actually no, social media is really, really hard. Any of us who've tried to be quite popular on social, it's not a simple thing to do, and it's even harder for brands because people don't tend to trust them in the same way. So what happens is you tend to see social media, how many times am I going to say social media today? You tend to see social media used quite sporadically, different things. They pick up trends, they do random posts for some audiences, random posts for others. They mix in authentic stuff with basically adverts, and it doesn't really work. And that's because social media needs to work much harder than other digital marketing channels, which none of my PPC or SEO colleagues are going to thank me for saying, but it does. You know, paid search, all of those things, they have very specific KPIs that tap into very specific intents, and it's very easy for them to do. But social's got to almost tap into the human psyche in a way that the other channels don't need to do. And that changes, and the trends change so quickly. You've got to really be on it. You've got to understand this community that you work with. Yeah, it is powerful for exactly that reason, because if you can mobilize that, you can do something that other channels, you have that emotional engagement that anything outside maybe big brand advertising can't really achieve. But I say all this just to be kind to yourself. Like, we've all run social media channels that are like really hard to get going. There's a lot of steps that we were talking through today. Yes, you employ them, but it takes time. So be kind to yourself when you're trying to do this stuff. But why is social so powerful? Well, for those exact reasons. It's different from the other channels because of these things. You know, why was social? Why did it get so big? Because it brought people together. It was real. You know, it was authentic. It wasn't adverts. Of course, the community aspect of it. It's normally quite tied into the zeitgeist, tied into what's happening at the time, which can people find exciting. And there is scope for spontaneity. There is scope for, oh my gosh, this thing just happened, let's respond to it. The problem, all of those things kind of scare people, particularly in financial services. They make people go, oh my gosh, do we want to tap into a whole group of people? You know, we want to be authentic, but let's push our advert out there. We want to be relevant, but be careful what you say. And we want to be spontaneous, but let's run this through compliance first. And you can't get away from all of that. But I think we need to be very aware that a lot of failed social media programs have actively worked to almost crush the four things that make social so brilliant in the first place. And we need to think about how to turn those things, not from scary things for our organizations, but how do we turn these things into benefits? So, inertia in a world of switches. It's a bit of an oxymoron of a title, right? Because everyone in financial services talks about switching, but they don't actually often switch. So everyone wants to look at price comparison to change their insurance. Everyone looks at what Mark Manure says about changing their mortgage vendor. People in B2B tend to talk with different vendors, but do they really move that often? And part of that is because they don't actually, not because they're loyal, and the word loyalty drives me crazy, okay? It's not loyalty. And why does that word drive me crazy? Well, for starters, people aren't dogs, right? Loyalty implies that it's this undying tie to their brand. They don't have that. Most people don't care less about the brand that they're with. They don't move because it's a pain to move. Now, that's not really a good basis for a relationship, is it? So how can we think about how to change this inertia into actual loyalty, or at least a sense of community? People don't stay with a brand because they're loyal. They stay because the effort of switching is too great, or even the fear of switching is too great. What if people stayed with financial services brands because they had a tied identity to it? Because they go, yeah, well, I'm with so-and-so, and they were proud of that fact. It does happen in financial services, but it's so limited. We'll talk about some case studies later. But it does happen in financial services, but it's so rare that maybe we need a bit of work on how we can encourage that. Because when trust is earned, or sometimes bought through attention but earned, then inertia is overcome. So what if customers are retained because they want to stay, not because they have to?
Thanks, Alex. So, what do we mean by community? Well, community is the difference between a passive audience and a loyal group of followers who act as cheerleaders for your brand. If it feels like your social media isn't getting the attention from your community like it used to, just know that you are not alone. Research has revealed that Facebook interactions have dropped by 80%. Instagram is struggling with an average engagement rate of just 0.43%, and TikTok brand engagement has been cut in half. Head of Instagram announced that sends are now a hero metric, shifting the focus away from likes and comments. While these metrics still matter, it's important to adapt and consider new ways to measure success as engagement evolves. Let's see what the head of Instagram had to say.
Some advice. One of the most important signals we use in ranking is sends per reach. So out of all the people who saw your reel or your photo, how many of them sent it to a friend in a DM? At Instagram, we're trying to be a place where people can be creative, but in a way that brings people together. We want not only to be a place where you passively consume content, but where you discover things you want to tell your friends about. A reel that made you laugh so hard you wanted to send it to your brother or your sister. Or a soccer highlight that blew your mind and you wanted to send it to another fan. That kind of thing. So don't force it as a creator, but if you can, when you're making content, think about making content that people would want to send to a friend, to someone that they care about. And it will help you reach over time. More advice to come. Peace.
So how can we adapt? We focus on building a community strategy for the evolving social landscape. This includes focusing on creating content that people actually want to share and save. So firstly, we need to look at relatability. So does your content feel personal? Does it really reflect the audience's experiences and everyday lifestyle? Secondly, we focus on entertainment and humour. That's things like memes, trends, really tapping into light-hearted content that's going to spark that joy, those laughs, those smiles. Thirdly, we focus on value and insight, so anything that's really providing education, anything that's going to make your audience have a thought and share with someone, ask a question, spark that conversation in the comments, anything that's really going to make them share with their friends. And lastly, we're looking at emotional impact. So content really that is evoking laughter, smiles, nostalgia, really strong emotions that's tapping on the heartstrings.
Okay, well that's all fantastic stuff, but reality check, this is financial services. You know, are people really going to engage with their bank, for example, online and on social? You know, it's a bit boring, right? Wrong. I think a campaign that we're all familiar with, or most of you will be familiar with, whether you were a Monzo customer or not, was the Monzo's You're in Monzo. Now, obviously, this was a take on Spotify's Wrapped thing, but what they did fantastically well here was tap into that. They saw what happened with Spotify Wrapped, they saw how popular that was, and made it actually more viral, if anything. I don't know whether I'm more ashamed of the fact that I ate loads of sausage rolls and McGregor's was a big spender, or that I'm super into Sting, but either way, they worked at that almost chaos of people's different preferences was really good juice for social media. So people were sharing it a lot. But what was actually really clever under all this is that what financial institutions do have is huge amounts of data. But also, they're not going to please everyone all the time. So you can imagine the internal battle happening here, with Monzo saying to their data protection people, yeah, we're going to use all of the purchases that all of our customers did to make this cool little app. Or to think, you can imagine that maybe they didn't have that internal battle because it's quite a new organisation. But that's you've got to think that through to do that sort of thing. But it is possible. Yeah, so you've got your use of data, you're tapping into the zeitgeist of the idea of people really like sharing their personal tastes, but also there's a bit of bravery there. Not everyone liked the You're in Monzo campaign. Some people thought, whoa, that's a bit crass, I don't like that. I didn't like it, all right? Everyone else did. That's okay, because you're not there to please everyone. You're there to get a reaction, there to build a community around a certain taste, and as they did that brilliantly. Okay, so when you're on most banking websites, you'll see that they talk a lot about stopping fraud. Some of this, it's really boring, dry content normally. It's trying to scare the hell out of you, or just talk in quite boring terms. The reason they do that, of course, is that because fraud costs banks, as well as causing yourselves a lot of pain and individuals a lot of worry. It also costs banks billions, right? So one of the big things they need to do is stop people getting scammed, because if you're with a good bank, they'll cover that. So, but it's a hard topic to get across. Santander did something brilliant here, where they used the whole scammer thing to get the message across, but they also used technology to do the whole scammer time, parachute pants thing at the same time. It became a thing. Everyone was taking the filter and using it in TikTok, and it became really popular for a period of time. So that's a really good example of using a pretty dry and actually a little bit scary topic and turning it into a trend. Again, using their own data and using the technology and the audience available to them. You'll see a lot on social media that people almost make a conscious choice between being quite slick or being quite organic, shall we say. All right. Now, two of the examples I've talked about previously have been the Monzo example, which they developed a whole app based on first-party data. Must have cost a lot of money. Even the TikTok filter with the parachute pants of MC Hammer, that takes money. That's not a spontaneous thing. However, what Starling Bank have done quite well is lean quite heavily into the genuine, I'm just a person posting about a thing that happens to me every day. And they do loads of these videos, and they all feel and it's an overused word, but they do generally feel very authentic. They tend to have the same 2 or 3 people in them, and they talk about when your mate forgets his wallet. They talk about when this happens and this happens. General everyday things. Back to that relevancy stuff we talked about right at the beginning. And it's, what happens is lots of the videos get 3 or 4 or 5 likes, maybe 10, 20. That's not lots, right? In the hundreds of thousands of people you can appeal to. But because they're able to produce them at such a rate and they are of a theme, they can create this body of work where they're always present, they're always producing stuff that shows that, look, we get your problems. And occasionally they have the odd one that really pops off and you have 100,000 people like it. So it's a different approach, but it's one that works really, really well if you can do it authentically. And this is one of our clients, Petgevity. Now, Petgevity had a very interesting challenge, that they were previously called another brand name, and they couldn't really reference that brand name when they became Petgevity. That's really hard. You've got a few hundreds of thousands of paws, as they call it, insured, but they also feel like a newcomer to the scene because people aren't necessarily familiar with the brand. One of the best ways to reach into your community is to, of course, use social media. Of course, the initial approach, and this was really not to do with poor strategy, this was to do with we needed to get something out there, was very polished, very uniform, very nice, but not very real. Okay, so what happened when they came to us and they wanted help with social media? Again, some of those resources, chances we've talked in the past, they wanted people to look after the social media for us. We took a whole step back and looked at what they were doing. And you can see here on the slide the difference between the way that the pictures came together before and how they look now. Now it looks like a real account, a bit memey, a bit, you know, it's a bit more, yes, it's clearly coming from a brand because there's a lot more of titles, but it's very different from a very polished, almost advertising-based feed. What else they did was use a lot of pet influencers, which helps them get a big boost to their own viewership at the same time. So yes, there's a bit of paid in there, but it's really natural relationships on top of having their own feed, and even some of our own agency and their pets are in this.
What other ways can we make our community thrive? Here's some examples on screen. So firstly, what we want to do is provide exclusive opportunities for our audience. This could include things like early access to events, limited edition drops, VIP perks, discounts, that sort of thing. Secondly, we have sneak peek. So that's giving your audience a little look behind the curtain before that product drops. This could be things like product innovations, behind the scenes at shoots, you know, a day in the life of a worker, really seeing their work unfold, having that little sneak peek for yourselves. And then lastly, we have members only content. So that's really sharing exclusive insights, interviews and tailored content that's going to make your audience feel valued and part of your community.
Okay, Finfluencers, possibly one of the worst words in the English language, a portmanteau as they call it, and we mean of course financial influencers. Now this is a world that's developed a lot over the last 5 years. So actually when I started Balance, huge record amounts of financial influencers had been either put in prison or fined across the world, particularly in the States. Celebrities were doing it, telling people to invest in this, and there was a huge crackdown globally on financial influencers. So that might make it sound like something to just be staying well away from, and actually for a little while we were advising that. But there's a big thing about financial influencers, and that when used well, they are, like the rest of social media, incredibly influential, no pun intended. They have a way, often, if you pick up a financial influencer who's already started doing their own content, they're already well known, is that the reason for that is because they're very good at breaking down topics that institutions themselves are not very good at doing, possibly because they're too deep into it, or they go so basic, institutions, that it's not very helpful. What you tend to do is when you get everyday language being used to talk about things, people feel a lot more safe, feel a lot more confident. They'll also ask questions potentially of the creators, and that can be very useful for you, both getting messaging across, but also almost borrowing the trust and transparency that arguably some financial institutions have lost. But absolutely, they're risky. Like I said, there have been huge amounts of fines. There is a very fine line in crossing between giving advice and giving tips. I mean, they're very similar. The really good financial influencers know that advice is a no-go, right? They won't tell you to invest in a certain thing. They won't tell you should do this with your mortgage, because that constitutes advice, and you have to be qualified to do that, because if you do it wrong, you can cause a lot of harm to someone's livelihood, right? That's why the rules exist, to protect people. But they can give you things to explain facts. These are the tax brackets. These are why this is a tax efficient way of doing things. This is when you should consider doing this. This is this type of language is far less committal. It's you should consider, you should look into. That's probably similar to what you might do if you try to type this stuff into ChatGPT these days. It would always say to you, but you should definitely consult with it as a professional advisor. So yeah, they're risky. You've got to use either an influencer, a relationship with an influencer that's experienced in these things, or work with an agency that knows how to find influencers that are experienced in these things. What influencers are in this sector can change quite a lot, actually in every sector, but in financial services, the biggest, most famous influencer is Martin Lewis, right? And he's hardly what you'd consider the standard influencer on TikTok or whatever. He's not really that kind of guy, right? But what he does, the power he has for a brand when he talks about things, I've seen websites break. Now, this isn't an advert for Martin Lewis, and indeed, a lot of his stuff is affiliate based, so he's paid to do a lot of things he does, which I don't think people always fully understand. But it's still, he's very, very influential, so don't have a narrow viewpoint about what these people can be. But also, take stock trading apps or things. The influencers themselves might not be paid, or they might be people who are genuinely interested in the topic and comparing the functionality of different banks, different apps, different services, and they can be in review sites as well. So there are lots of different ways out there. But also, micro-influencers can be very, very powerful. So if you have someone, I saw someone just 2 days ago, Cardiff-based, who was talking through tax brackets. And this guy's not got a huge following, but it's enough for his business in his local area. He never has to have millions and millions of followers. He has to have just enough to keep his business going. If you're a brokers, if you're an accountancy firm that works within a regional area, you don't need to be huge. You just need to be big enough.
So just to recap everything we spoke about today, to really stand out in the evolving social media landscape, we need to focus on a few key areas. Firstly, it's understanding your identity, identifying your audience, aligning with your audience's needs, creating meaningful connections, defining what resonates, leveraging emotional appeal, and lastly, creating engaging content that's really going to encourage those saves and shares.
Thank you for joining our webinar today and watching our YouTube video on social media in financial services. As I said at the top of our presentation, be kind to yourself. Social is deceptively difficult to get right, but there's a lot of steps here that we've talked through that can at least help you get there. We hope you've had fun and learned some things today. If there's any more that you'd like to get in touch with us about, by all means, leave something in the comments or get in touch on our email address.